Welcome to Cyber Focus from the McCrary Institute, where we explore the people and ideas shaping and defending our digital world. I'm your host, Frank Cilluffo, and welcome back. Happy New Year. Excited to have our first episode of Season 2. We have two guests who've previously appeared to talk about what cyber could look like in a Trump administration, what it should look like, what it might look like, and what it will look like. Couldn't ask for two better or more informed individuals. We have Matt Hayden, who served in initial Trump administration at DHS and CISA, and very thoughtful on cyber issues at GDIT and a senior fellow of the McCrary Institute, and Admiral Mark Montgomery, who is at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, was the executive director of cybersolarium.org 2.0, and of course served as the staff director of the Solarium Commission. So really excited about today's conversation. Buckle up for a busy year. Excited to have you. Matt, let's start with you. So what do we think we're going to see here?
Well, the first thing you know is it's going to be unpredictable because it has to be. It's the Trump administration. There's almost a strength in that. So we're looking at the previous administration had a heavy hand in regulatory reform. And across the board, it still has a pretty bipartisan tone. But where you're going to see a strength from the Trump administration is really in balancing the government's role and that deterrence effect. And so rather than lean heavily into regulatory controls and adding new regulations or reestablishing that baseline, first off, they're going to start to reset the relationship with what consider cyber adversaries. Look at those playbooks, look at the strength that can be deployed. And then as we start to look at things like our sector by sector challenges, where can we use carrot versus stick to try and improve those? Now, I don't think the Sector Risk Management Agency concept is in any way challenged by a new administration, especially the Trump administration. I think it'd actually be bolstered because I'd rather have it be put in the hands of those that are directly engaging with those stakeholders. So I think we'll see some strength there. I think the largest change you'll see is that there'll be a lot of personalities that are going to come to bear that are going to have a lot to say about who is coming in and disrupting critical services to the United States and how the broader, we're used to the term full spectrum, but we're used to it meaning both offense and defense. I think you're going to start to see this administration considering full spectrum, all levers of government to deter adversaries from disrupting anything. And if they're using cyber, we're going to make sure that's part of that formula.
Well, we'll definitely much more to pull there. But Mark, what are your initial thoughts here?
First, glad to be here on year two. I guess my year one appearance passed the whatever check.
As always,
happy to be here, Matt. Look, first I want to agree and say, and I'll articulate it this way and say, I think they're going to be more aggressive. I think they're going to be more offensive, and some of that offense will be in the defense. In other words, the idea being that we've had enough of this. We've had Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, Flax Typhoon, as I like to joke, corn dog typhoons coming. I mean, basically intellectual property theft, the denial of services, theft of data, and then finally operational preparation of the battlefield. We have to respond to China, and that's going to mean, I would not be surprised if you see a named operation for the defense of some critical infrastructure. It can't be all of it at once. I think that would be overwhelming. But maybe pick a critical infrastructure, one that's clearly unable to protect itself, say something like water, and do a named operation where they get more government support. In other words, National Guard units get aligned to support things, either through gubernatorial authorities, which are easy, governors' authorities, which are easy, or through DHS authorities. Another big one I see is I do see the regulatory harmonization effort. I think that was bipartisan in nature, and it's an inherently conservative aspect. Regulatory harmonization generally means a reduction in regulation. So I think you'll see a push for that. But it already had strong support from Harry Coker, the leader, Biden's National Cyber Director, and it's passed on the normal 12-1 vote in the HISGAC, where Senator Paul is consistently a no. But I also want to mention two other things. One, on the military side, and look, I'm self-serving here. I've been the biggest advocate for the cyber force. I do think there's going to be a push for cyber force. I think they've been gone 4 years. They come back and look. This isn't the only issue on this. And they go, things have not improved despite our investment, despite the Biden administration's investment. Our fourth generation, the fourth generation of cyber forces has not improved dramatically, whereas the Chinese one and Russian ones have. We're going to try a different effort. And the final thing is, I do think you'll see a fixation on military mobility. In other words, when you start saying, which critical infrastructures am I going to prioritize and attack, a great way to put a national security blend on it is to call it military mobility and say that's like rail, aviation, ports, the electrical power grids that undergird them, making sure they're secure so that military forces can flow from Fort Cavazos, former Fort Hood, to Charleston, port, or to Columbus Airfield, and then can flow out of our 69 strategic airlift ports or our 19 strategic sealift ports, the vast majority of which are operated by the private sector.
So to put a fine point on mission assurance and anything that can impede the ability to project power, deploy forces, right? That's broad. That touches all of our transportation infrastructure and everything that enables that.
And Trump 45 actually tackled this on the basis. A mutual friend of all three
Ken
of ours.
Rapuano.
Ken Rapuano, but also Lucian Neumeier was involved in
this.
this.
And Lucian,
those guys actually tackled this. Now, the problem is, it's fine for if you're a tank sitting on a rail car at Fort Cavazos and you have 2 comm systems, 2 power systems, 2 water systems, it's great. And as you leave the base, you head into basically Mad Max Thunderdome on like Norfolk Southern. That's a problem, right? We need to actually make all of the military mobility infrastructure that laces around the United States. It's about 2,500 miles of rail, and like I said, the 69 airfields and 19 ports have got to be secure at the same way Fort Cavazos is secure, or Fort Moore, whatever, Fort Eisenhower, that we're in that same position.
So, and before we get into sort of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency and Office of National Cyber Director, I'd be curious: are you surprised we don't have a lot of names formally nominated for these cyber roles?
I think that there's a challenge.
And we're biased because for me, Cyber 1, 2, 3 is always a priority. So I get that.
The president and his team have a list of priorities, and the good news for folks that are interested in cyber is cyber touches
everything.
All of them.
Yep.
And so there's both a bias to see names early as well as to see that incorporated early, but it's there. And so the people that are coming
including your own name, Matt, I might add. So,
well, I it's always an honor to be in those conversations, and if this administration knows where to find me. At the same time, I think they're really recruiting some people that are not traditional. So they're looking for folks that have a real ability to get action and change across some of these administrations where it's areas where it's tough. And so I think that you're going to see your typical cabinet first, assistant secretaries and the like kind of move in after that. And you're going to have your core Schedule Cs, and they'll start to come in first weeks and months. We usually don't get like a CISA director level person until about 6 months in. And so we're looking for some of those senior individuals to be vetted and brought in. Sometimes as senior advisor roles, you get the tea leaves of sneaky people who are hanging around the secretaries. But that's a throw to Chris Krebs, who was everywhere and nowhere all at the same time until he was director. But I think we will start to get a lot more information in the weeks to come. But this has not been a traditional DC-based transition in the sense that we've had the same fabric that we're used to. They're operating in a different manner.
Mark, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'm hoping. One thing I would stipulate, and you're absolutely right, confirmed jobs take a while. An assistant secretary confirmed people
are not going to be
in Department of Defense are 6-7 months in. Yeah. However, all the NSC needs to be named because basically the NSC, with exception of a handful of detailees, departs on January 20th. I'd say with the NCD, the senior leadership, I mean, they're keeping 45 out of 90 people, but the 45 who are leaving are generally from the top end of the spectrum, and 5 of the top 6 are leaving, all Schedule Cs. Now, look, they're not going to name the NCD and get them confirmed in a week, but underneath the National Cyber Director, you've got 4 jobs. They need to name at least 1 or 2 of those people. They need to name at least 1 or 2 of the assistant directors or the deputy director of CISA who come in, without confirmation. At each of these places, you have to put in 1 or 2 of your people on day one. That way, and obviously at the NSC, it's the whole team. We'll say a senior director plus 4 or 5 directors. They all need to come in on day one so they can continue to do the job and provide the political guidance. Because in the end, elections have consequences. The president was elected. His people go in and carry out his policies, and it's easier said than done. And I would contrast that with, say, the Assistant Secretary of Defense, which we're not going to see for 8 or 9 months. And luckily, there's a principal deputy there she was previously the principal deputy, Ashley Manning. She'll just do great, relieving Michael Suhlmeyer when he leaves on the last day of the Biden administration. So from my perspective, there are certain jobs that need to be named. And, we don't need to hear those names. Frankly, they have a discussion with a person. She or he starts the paperwork, and we'll find out that their name, because they're of they're not that senior, that they just show up on January 20th, we find out they have the job. And, Twitter, X tells us they have the job, or maybe LinkedIn, that's about it. And I'm okay with that for the vast, but there's several hundred jobs like that in the government, of about 15 or 20 of which are in cyber, that need to be named and done in a quiet way. And hopefully they're people we know, and no real hand grenades in there, and I think we'll be in great shape.
Yeah.
So building on sort of the more muscular and aggressive stance, and I've been a big advocate for this for a long time. We're never simply going to firewall our way out of this problem. What do you think that actually looks like? And a big issue, I think, that is going to be front and center is whether or not to split off Cyber Command and NSA, and which is currently dual-hatted. Any thoughts on either of those?
So right now, there seems to be a pretty happy balance when you talk to both agencies. They are pretty appreciative of having joint leadership because they feel like they get the proper representation in every conversation. When it comes to the political aspect of that, the NSA director has always been seen as almost a political position, similar to the FBI and others. And so there's this fabric that pulls there. I don't see that being a day one issue, but it's probably something that'll get addressed to try and see if those can operate autonomously. I don't think there will be a net gain initially by both agencies in splitting them up, but I do think that they'll have the opportunity to decide what they truly do at that point. One of the things that I'm hoping they take advantage of is if you look at the DoD strategy in 23, the defend forward language in that strategy is going to be good, and they've got to use that, and it includes non-governmental critical infrastructure that they're going to need to protect against attack. And so when we start to pair those types of mentalities with a developing cyber command, it doesn't hurt that NSA is there, but they can still do that even if they're bifurcated.
Yeah, Mark, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, a couple thoughts. So first, on the muscular response, I think, I've said this before, the National Guard is going to be a role of this. I think they're going to take a hard look at what's their role, both working for the Department of Homeland Security or working for governors. I think we should push away from Title 10 or Title 50 forces getting involved domestically. Title 50 because you bring in some real
but under Title
issues.
32 in the Guard.
But Title 10 forces coming in under Title 32 or Guard forces going to Title 32.
Yep.
But again, there's not enough Title 10 forces to do their mission that I expect them to be doing overseas. So I'd like to use those, but this is going to take a lot of organization, a lot of thought. I do think Cyber Command is starting to think about it a little bit more. Congress can't help itself. They have 2 to 3 Guard or Cyber Reserve ideas every cycle, none of which pass, by the way, because we really don't. We're going to take a look at it at the CSC 2.0, writing out what the fulsome policy, explain everything to Congress so they can make a coherent decision. In the end, they're going to have to order this because of the National Guard versus services friction. Inside the Department of Defense, just so we know, the number one enemy is not China, or the Army's number one enemy is not China or Russia, it's the Guard, because of budgetary fights and things like that. I'm being slightly facetious, but still, they see it. The other one I'd say, the dual hat's interesting. Look, it's not lost on most of us that President Trump thought about splitting the dual hat late in his first presidency. He was convinced not to by people who told him, don't worry, it'll be done in a couple of years. Just give us 2 more years. Well, he comes now 4 years later, there's been no movement. My recommendation to General Hawk, the Cyber Command NSA, current dual-headed Cyber Command NSA commanders, look, we're still not ready, in my opinion, for that to happen. To get ready is probably going to take the 18 or 24 months that they previously said, but he better come in with a fulsome plan for how to do it, show the president where the benchmarks are, and tell him the resources he needs, because I agree with you. It's not a net positive. When you split these 2 plus 2 is not going to equal 5. 2 plus 2 is going to equal 3. And that's because they don't really have the functional groups at Cyber Command that they have at NSA. They have to rebuild those. And then there's new bills coming, like AI data for each of them to go through. The kind of data collection you need to run your AI projects on them. You don't want to build it twice. So they're going to have rule sets for that. In other words, I want 2 plus 2 to equal 5 with two separate services. That's probably 3, 4, 5 years away.
Yeah.
So look, I hope we don't. We may need to do it because elections have consequences. And if the president decides he wants to do it, he's the president. Mm-hmm. But let's do it in a way that 2 plus 2 equals 5.
8 years ago, I was a big advocate of splitting when it just shortly after it stood up, because I felt like the Title 10 mission was given second fiddle to the Title 50 mission, the intelligence mission, and no one wanted to compromise the secret. But I've seen that change, and I just don't know if we have the women and men to support. I mean, even combined, it's going to be hard. But you can also say that NSA is a combatant subordinate command to all the other combatant commands, is it not?
That's correct. And of course, we'll have all the people we need if you do that Cyber Force recommendation I've been pushing.
Yeah, okay. So then I was going to, you knew I was going to egg you on that. Okay, so Cyber Force. So you and I may not have full concurrence on this. I think we do agree on the diagnosis. Yep. The Cyber National Mission Force and getting the right bodies, but lay out your thoughts there, and I'd be curious what Matt is. I'll try not to be too biased here.
So first thing I want to say, this is not about Cyber Command. Cyber Command thinks it's about Cyber Command. They just put out a Cyber Command 2.0 that says they're going to fix the fourth generation problem, even though they don't own any of the tools. That's like me saying, I'm going to fix the problem with the New York Giants offense. Last time I checked, no one's calling me for draft choices, and that's a bad one to fix. But my point on this is...
My Jets aren't much better, but that's okay.
Our diagnosis,
we managed to win when it.
So our mutual diagnosis, I think, is that the current fourth generation model isn't working. Mm-hmm. We're not recruiting the right people. We're not training them. We're not maintaining them. We're not retaining them. Mm-hmm. And the really best retained ones go to civilian life at NSA.
Yep.
So we've got to figure out how to generate forces properly. I think a unique cyber service will do it. It's going to start with here's a few paradigm shifts you can do with a unique service. One, you don't have to look like Sergeant Rock. You can look like whoever you look like. You can have a face tattoo. Your most recent, weed usage can be last week, But what you can do is you can code in Python. You can code in some other things. You have an imagination and a creativity. You might even have a little more ADD than we usually take in the military service. There's all kinds of things like that are opportunities. And by the way, when you look at the actual Army, not the units in the field, it's about 98, 99% uniform, 1 or 2% civilian. Cyber's already about 80-20. I would make it about 50-50. And I would change the paradigm there. Not everyone goes to boot camp. The 50% that are civilian don't. They're in a different pay scale mapping. They're in different, you have there's a great opportunity here to recruit a different type of people. And I got to tell you, Army recruiters are working hard just to make their current means, and they're doing it by sitting outside the football locker room, men's and women's soccer and basketball locker rooms. Yeah. We need them sitting outside, the e-gaming, the robotics, the chess club. That's where the creativity is. And the club of kids who aren't quite going to graduate. And that's, to me, recruiting the right people, then training them, maintaining them differently. That's how we get to a successful force. Let's be clear. In the time when a few of us slapped the table on what was the size of the cyber force in 2010, it was 2,100 from each service and a handful from the Army, Navy, Air Force, a handful from the Marines. We'll say about 6,400. We're probably at about the new table slapped 6,800 12 years later. So we've grown like under 10%, maybe 6-7%. The Chinese have grown 7 or 8 fold. The Russians have grown 2 or 3 fold. Something's wrong here. Someone's right and someone's wrong, and we're wrong.
Well, we never win the numbers game vis-a-vis Beijing. But Matt, what are your thoughts on this?
The challenge that I'll put my DHS bias on display. The challenge is that we always had this vision from DHS and working with DoD that the defense versus offense scale was never going to be level. And when we hear about Cyberforce, it really feels like the same way that DoD sees Cyber Command, even though you got some caveats there, the defend forward model. So when it comes time to what do we do in the event of a multi-critical infrastructure outage, it doesn't translate as cleanly with a cyber force. And so from a DoD perspective, the resilience side is going to feel pretty poached in that environment because you're saying not only do we want to create, because right now the resilience side has a problem with all the best and the brightest going to NSA too. And so if you're trying to get people that are solving vulnerability problems at scale for defense and you have this new shiny object, you're also having a personality, because it's still a small population that we're talking about here, at least until we get a new machine running that creates new cyber operators.
You know, and Mark, disagree with me on this, because I do completely buy your argument that we are not where we need to be, and doing the same thing over and over certainly ain't going to lead to the outcome we hope. That said, I feel like we're constantly in reorg. We're constantly looking at boxes and org charts. DC loves that. But the reality is how long will it take to yield the results? And I just feel like we're just punting and punting and punting and punting. And at some point we got to do.
So let me tackle both of those. So first I'd say this is not about Cyber Command and its mission, right? Again, whether Cyber Command is doing a good job or not is a separate issue. It is impacted by this failure to do good force generation. I agree with both of you that we need to get tap into new bodies. The whole idea here is to
and different types too.
Different types. One thing I'd say right now, our current system is like when a kid joins the Air Force, he goes to a MEP or the Navy. He goes to an area where they select their future career thing. Mm-hmm. And first of all, in the Navy one, all the really smart kids on the test go nuke. They try to force them into it. If that doesn't work, they go ages.
Including the late Jimmy Carter, President.
Yeah, that's
Carter,
right, and including myself.
Mm-hmm.
And
well,
I wasn't
you,
a smart
kid,
but
you are and still are.
So ages, and then finally cyber. And look, it's not based on who's we didn't like recruit. We needed 10 people. We recruited 10 kids who coded with Python. No, it's are you smart? You're a smart kid. Come here, sign here.
Yeah, physics.
And so when you go to Air Force units that do some of their most complex stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Say, developing open source, tools for penetrating for putting malware in open source systems, they'll tell you 93% of our people do none of the work. And they're good Americans. 6 or 7% are capable of doing this. But I'm assigned these 100 people, 92 of them just can't do the work. We have a broken force generation system. I want to get a healthy one. I think it's through a cyber force. Look, I don't want to grow it to 100,000 like the Chinese or 70,000, whatever the actual number is hard to pin down. But what I want to do is get it from, we haven't had that much box changing. We basically started with 6,340, and 2 years ago we said it was going to be 6,700. That's the box.
Numbers.
But the services have never changed how they're doing this. That's what's crazy about this. And what really worries me is if you went to the service and said we got double the size, they would go, wait a minute, I'm going to lose the manpower for 4 ships, 6 aircraft squadrons, 4 battalions. I'm not supporting that.
That's right.
If you would all believe we need more WhatsApp in cyber, then I think you got to go to a cyber force. I can be proven wrong. I would love if a solution other than not mine, the ones that we put forward comes out. But I think, like you kind of implied there, 13 years of doing the same thing and going back and doing it again is clinical insanity.
You see, my concern is this. President turns to the cupboard and finds it bare. So if we are going muscular and leaning forward, we got to make sure we can match that.
You have to think about also in the transition aspect of things, you're going to get those traditional briefings of where are we with China? When I was here last time, you guys said Xi is looking at 2027 as an action. Is that still the case? What have we done about it? And when you start those conversations with a critical audience, you get a lot of real fast feedback. I expect that the question of, well, where are we for 2027 in the realm of possibilities that we have an obligation to respond in a certain way, especially if the threats of holding our critical infrastructure hostage is considered real. And with the typhoons, you have to start to think that way.
Let me ask both of you, how would you have responded? I mean, Salt, Volt, and Flax Typhoon, each one on their own is a really bad storm. Collectively, it is this window of, it's the perfect storm. How would you have responded?
I would have taken Volt Typhoon as pre-positioning for conflict.
And that's what it is.
And I would have made it all the cards are on the table at this point. We're going to make sure our adversary that is performing these things knows that we're treating it as an entrance to conflict. The others, it's harder because, I mean, I see
espionage is espionage, second oldest profession,
and it's tough to you always do the public slapping of hands, but you don't have that. You're now in conflict style engagement. And so I think that had it not been for Volt Typhoon, I probably would have a different opinion. But post
Salt and flax.
right
Yeah,
post Volt Typhoon. It's a different conversation.
Mark, anything you do
well, first of all, I
different?
agree. Volt Typhoon's actually the most
concerning and
Yes.
disconcerting.
And I
yes,
treat the
without
three
a
of them
doubt.
three different ways. Volt Typhoon was operational preparation of the battlefield. What I would do is I would have aggressively struck back at their cyber critical infrastructure and then talked about it.
Mm-hmm.
And then said,
Because
"We
it
did
has to
this."
be public,
It
right?
has to be
That
public.
is that's
It has to be public. And
Yep.
we'd have blown some tools.
Yep.
We'd have blown some access.
and that's okay.
And I'd have said, but that's more important because it slows this process down. Not doing it, like, look, Salt Typhoon was probably already going on. I think we now know.
Yeah,
I mean,
I think we
we're
now
not very
know
good at admitting how
they
long
brought them
things-
together. Yeah.
But Salt Typhoon was espionage. You go back with espionage. I get
Yep,
it.
yep.
And Flax Typhoon was this kind of like messing with the private sector, a little bit of like government email. With that, I would do the sanctions and the other things.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is we've been soft on sanctioning China, Russia, and Iran in the sense of we will very discreetly sanction the front piece. And if you think about Russian oil sanctions, where the shadow fleet's still working because we're only sanctioning the Russian company who doesn't care. They're getting paid under the table or with cryptocurrency in a different way. But we got to go over the secondary and tertiary sanctions. Same with Iran and same with China and North Korea and cyber. So from my perspective, you handle all three differently, but you handle them that way, and it's got to be public. And look, I know this makes them like everyone gets hot on the collar when you talk about blowing, like blowing a
Unique
an access or
capability,
a unique
yeah.
capability.
Yeah.
Noted.
Yeah.
At some point, you have to do it. By the way, they're
That
doing
was
it
my
to us.
argument for splitting off NSA and Cybercom 100 years because we always erred on that side.
And so, look, remember, this is a country, China, that blew a massive zero-day exploitation on just reading Gina Raimondo's email before a visit. I mean, I remember I was talking to our mutual friend Dick Clark afterwards. I said, God, I can't believe they would waste such a big zero-day, just to read her email before a visit to China. He goes, Mark, that's not the issue. The issue is how many 0 days do they have that they're willing to blow one on reading Gina Raimondo's email? And he's probably right.
Touche.
How big is the
Touche.
Yeah.
Touche. So let's go to CISA and NCD. So this is not the purpose of our conversation, but you were all part of our effort that we looked into in terms of priorities for the incoming transition. Agnostic at the time, we didn't know who would be elected, but where do we see CISA and NCD? And maybe we'll start with Mark on NCD, and then we'll go to CISA.
Okay, so on NCD, first, the number one, look, you and I were part of creating NCD.
So I am very biased in that one, and
That's right.
I'm
As
happy to
am I.
be biased.
I think a few things. One, in fairness, the Biden administration came in with solar winds beating them. NCD was going to take it should have taken 2 months. It took 5 months to name Chris Inglis, and then it took him about 6 months to have a reasonable critical mass of staff. Okay. Knowing there's an 11-month gap coming and not looking to help it that much, they appointed a deputy national security advisor for cyber. So I think they got off to a good start on that. I think over time, the deputy national security advisor was a domestic security role that conflicted both with the Homeland Security Advisor and her roles and the resilience roles in the White House. Conflicted with the National Cyber Director, conflicted with the National Economic Council, conflicted with the OSDP, and conflicted with CISA and Department of Homeland Security, and to a lesser degree with DOD. I think that job will probably be brought back to where it belongs, a senior director, because and in fairness to the Biden administration, there was solar winds, and China's been working hard. But I think you can now bring it down and say you're in charge of offense. If we're going to say offense that important, you've got
and we should
the
call
execution
it that, right?
of NSPM 13. I would say that's the senior director for cyber operations, offensive and international operations. International because it has to work with Nate
absolutely,
because you need White House support to Nate fix cyber and digital policy, his successors, and cyber and digital policy at State Department. So that leaves the NCD then. So I think there's a great opportunity here to put NCD will have what it had before, which is the budgetary role working with OMB, which is good for holding federal agencies accountable. The workforce role, because no one else wants it, but work with OPM, try to fix the federal workforce. Write the strategy, track strategic implementation. But then here's the big ad. And there's two of them. There's two big ads. One is I would give them responsibility for the management of the critical infrastructure relationship with the White House.
Which we proposed in our
here. And then I'd also give them a more significant policy role where the start of a cyber response group, the start of an incident is with them. They do the IPC, the below deputies level. They might even do the deputies. If it clearly is getting to principals level and now involves more than just cyber, then the NSC takes it over. But use the NSC functionality with the NCD running it,
which
and you
CTIC
have a,
can help.
That's right,
set
and you
the
have a
stage
dual-hatted
for them on that.
senior director at NSA, a dual-hatted director at NSC, working also in NCD, so that you can do that policy management. That was the last thing you and I and Nick Lesterson, who was our congressional lead, traded away to get NCD done back when we passed the law. And if I could go back in time, I wouldn't have given up that policy role.
Net bullish.
Net bullish. Now, I want to say one last thing. I think NCD needs to be like a former CEO of a major, say, energy company who's independently wealthy and respected by President Trump. I can think of a few people like, say, Tom Fanning. That would be, and I think
He'd be a phenomenal candidate.
Tom Fanning, who's your fellow commissioner on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, worked closely with me. I think, and he stayed current. He was the advisor, the CISA Advisory Council advisor for the last 3.5 years for Jen Easterly's CISA. He's and he's already been considered by President Trump from another job. So whatever that
we'd be lucky to have Tom.
He's passed it. I think we'd be thrilled and lucky, and he would enjoy it. And I think he'd do a great job. And he and Mike Waltz would be a great team.
Well said. Well said. Let's go to CISA.
So CISA needs to be operational, and not just operational in the sense of being independent from headquarters and being more mature as an agency. They have...
Do you think it should be integrated back into DHS? Is that...
Well, they have the capability right now through the .gov framework to look for and hunt across and to see bad things happening at speed. So responding at speed is a different thing, but they can get that kind of information at speed. And so there's a world where they do that for the have-nots of cyber and critical infrastructure.
Which is essential.
And that's where they need to get to. So they have to get better at what they do with the .gov and start to work that into the have-nots in the critical infrastructure community, like municipalities and things like that. So health is going to be one that they could take on and make their bones for years on. I think that the challenge that CISA has is that they've always accepted every mandate happily because it's always the urgent moment in time issue. They're going to have to really harmonize on just cyber vulnerabilities or physical vulnerabilities that impact critical infrastructure in a way that keeps them more focused. I think they've been a little bit spread thin, and also they have a workforce of about 8,000 people and a budget that's about half of what they need to perform what they're told to do now. And so they're going to have to show some maturity and a plan to get a good utilization of that full budget. At the same time, they're going to have to demonstrate that they're not going to pivot on a dime every time there's a new incident.
Net bullish, bearish.
I think they're going to.
It's going to be refocused.
It's going to be refocused. I think you're going to have a lot of outside voices at the White House and otherwise that are going to make sure CISA has its mission honed.
And I think when people take the genuine time to understand its mission, it's not a zero-sum set of issues, right?
Yeah, let me bring up one thing too. As has been put, they have been criticized rightfully for talking too much about disinformation. They actually don't do much. So this is a $2.9 billion.
So that's disinformation.
Yeah, it's a $2.9 billion agency. By the way, grown very well by Congress from 1.5 to almost $3 billion over the last 5 years. Representative Katko, a former Republican representative, would say it's a $5 billion organization. Yeah, fellow at the Curry. But he, what I would say is, look, I'd talk to Senator Paul. I'd say, hey, Dr. Paul, let's use a scalpel to remove what you don't like, not a chainsaw. Because right next to it, you got to lop off that disinformation, but leave the sector risk management coordination, leave the .gov management, leave those essentials that if they don't do it, you have to pay somebody, you have to build it and pay for it elsewhere. Which wastes money, which is what Paul's trying to save. Slice off the 10 million or less that you don't like, leave the rest of the money to do what you do like, or what you can put up with, and what the rest of the Senate and the House like, and let's get that done. So I'm bullish if they can get past the Rand Paul test.
And quite honestly, we probably need that test to be able to address, because I mean, oversight is essential.
And he is the chairman.
And he is the chairman. But I do think the scalpel is the.
And he is a doctor.
No pun intended. Matt, any other thoughts on that?
I think that they have an opportunity to actually explain what they do a little better. I think that they've had the shelter of their America's Cyber Agency for the last 6 years has allowed them to just kind of operate a bit in the shadows. And so I think that while you see the leadership out and about, knowing what CISA actually does day to day, especially on a congressional side, is tough. I think that I am disappointed that CISA doesn't come out and say almost daily how many organizations they have stopped an incident from. They have programs in which they have, I think it's up to 1,200 individual companies and critical infrastructure partners that they actually stopped a ransomware incident from happening. And they don't talk about that enough.
And here's what I struggle with. If not there, where?
Yeah.
I mean, not DOD, because we need more there.
They run from it.
But we need more there
not FBI,
anyway. Not FBI, because the private sector wouldn't trust them. If
there's not a good place when there was other plans that said things like DOT. I mean, there's not a good home. That's just not a non-starter.
But they do have like Representative Garbarino, who's chaired the Cyber Subcommittee on the Homeland Security, has been very supportive, as has recently Representative Mark Green, the overall chair of Homeland. They have friends, Gary Peters, the ranking on his guy,
absolutely,
Jim Langford. They've had people, active participating members who are supportive. They're going to survive. Even Senator Paul, when he kind of jokes about, I'd like to get rid of him, he then says, but I know I probably can.
Yeah.
So please take a scalpel, lop off what you didn't like, and let's get down to business. And I love what you said, Matt. You're exactly right. They are crappy. I mean, I would say the other word, but they're crappy they're good at the self-promotion about their existence. They're not good at the self-promotion about their successes.
Right.
Yeah.
And I would get out there. And I know that's because you're always scared something will get disproven. You're always scared that the next day one of the people you're helping gets screwed.
Exactly.
You got to take the risk. Get out there and say, and look, just call winners and losers and get moving. I mean, that's how you succeed.
And to me, that's about mission orientation. And how would you executives from, and I do tend to lump the private sector in one bucket. Obviously, it's very different in terms of telecommunications, electricity, utilities, yada 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 yada. But where do you think the private sector fits in?
So I think CIRCIA is going to bring all of that home. So CIRCIA is going to come out. I don't think this administration is going to throw it out once they get the idea that there is a dog catches car moment coming in which you're actually going to see the number of incidents across critical infrastructure that currently we assume. And there's a lot of concern that we've been putting our eggs in the small proportion of events basket. And so you need a CISA to be there to really make that a translatable and to set those priorities and to establish where those things all hit. The private sector is going to appreciate not the requirements of reporting, but they're going to appreciate that there's a prioritization of government resources, effort, and consistency that's set by something logical. Not to knock our friends in Congress, but it's not set by Congress. It's set by a relative mirror that is a reflection of what's going on in their industry, in their world right now. And that's going to posture us to be more successful.
But Chevron deference does demand Congress become a little more prescriptive, right? We did have Mark Green on recently discussing this.
I think that the challenge with a lot of those rules, and as a person who only resides with attorneys and is not one, I will say that it does keep the CIRCIA action in the modern language it has.
Congressional intent, at least.
Yes, there's a lot more there than some of the other challengeable.
Mark,
items.
anything?
No, I agree. And look, I look at it wasn't like people look like, oh, post Chevron we're screwed. I'm like, well, pre Chevron, what was the success? Look, I get it. Nuclear power is well regulated in cybersecurity. Space, if it was in infrastructure, but it's pretty well regulated.
We'll start the new year with that.
American people accept regulation when they think I may die with a lack of regulation. And so, look, we generally regulate the right things, the things American people care about. I think there's going to be an agreement for standard setting, working with the private sector to agree to a standard, assess to it, and hold people accountable to that standard. And how you hold them accountable is where you get into this. Is it regulatory, or is it done by an NGO or somebody else on behalf of the government? That's what I would like to see.
And remove duplicative.
That's right. Yeah. But also allow the associations to police themselves, but have a standard. But you also need to have grant money to fix problems, because the vast majority of these problems are not like Goldman Sachs isn't struggling with its cybersecurity investment. Jim's Rural Bank Federal Credit Union number 7 in Plano, they're struggling with their cybersecurity investment. Same with water, same with rural electrical, same with rural healthcare. All these things need access to funding. And, you and I have spoken about this before.
Cool.
Getting the state and local governments and their utilities access to funds is going to be critical
essential
going forward. And I know we don't like to talk about spending money, but that's the kind of grant money most Americans are okay with because it comes back to their community.
Well, SLGCP fund is essential, is it not, Matt?
It is. At the same time, giving them, I think that's where it falls back to kind of a CISA element to where you have almost like the way they have structured their CDM packages. You have a catalog of, you buy this, here is a secure cloud enclave with these features and put your stuff in it. And so there's a way to work with some of these critical infrastructure partners that are small and don't have resources to where we have things that can just put together zero trust, all the buzzwords, and have it ready to go for them to where they don't have to make as much an investment.
And I wouldn't allow you to get grant money till you complete a government approved assessment. In other words, what drives you to prioritize your biggest problems needs to be, you can't have our money until you play in our program. I think
as long as it's not run by accountants.
No, it's got to be. No, it's got to be. And look, these programs. By the way, this is harder than it seems. The water industry's had state revolving funds in the tune of $4 or $5 billion a year for a decade, and cybersecurity taps about 0.1% of it, and it's been allowed to tap it for about 6 years. That's because it's hard and it's run by accountants who make the. So you have to set up a system where someone's working with a nonprofit or an NGO that does the assessment and then says, by the way, you had numbers 4, 8, and 11 wrong. Here's the form to get the repair, whatever the patching or whatever it is to fix 4, 8, and 11. In other words, you have to be a helping hand if you're going to do this. And that's why I agree. It's not the government. It's not accountants. It's cyber professionals running these organizations. There is this way to do this. The American people are entrepreneurial, smart enough that we can get this done, but it's going to take a lot of effort.
Since the end of the Cold War, I often say threat forecasting has made astrology look respectable, and I don't have a crystal ball, but I'd be curious. Net surprise, positive, negative. What are your two, Matt? Positive and negative.
I think positive is a reflection on the negative, is that we're finding adversaries that didn't want us to find them.
That is a silver lining.
I think that as we go, I think in the next 6 months we're going to find more. I think that's the frustration. And so, but I still see that as a positive because they did not intend for us to find them. And so our detection and identification attribution abilities are increasing. And from a negative perspective, I hope that we don't overplay that everything's broken. I think that there is a tendency, especially with Salt Typhoon, to say, "Oh my gosh, all our communication networks are awful. We got to rip and replace everything in the comm sector." I think
there is some ripping and replacing that might have to go on.
That may have to go on in certain areas and for certain hardware, but there is that baby in the bathwater conversation that I'm concerned about.
Mark?
And so that positive, I agree, is our adversary is making sure we don't lose, that we're actually staying focused on this. I mean, it is a shocking degree.
But they got to vote in this, right? I mean,
voting, And I'd say, by the way, if you go one cousin over supply chain, we have the exact same issues going on. It's shocking how many of our weapon systems are proliferated with Chinese secondary and tertiary parts. The negative, the one that worries me is I really do believe, even as a senior military officer who wrote the war plans for either Russia and then later for China, I had no real understanding of how much we were relying on our own national critical infrastructure to fight the war. I kind of saw it only at the pointy end. The whole tail and the tooth to tail is riding on civilian infrastructure. So my concern is that civilian infrastructure is as vulnerable as anything else in America, as vulnerable as can be, without access to funds to rapidly fix it. So I don't want to sound overly negative, but we have got to identify this problem and fix it rapidly.
No, that's very thoughtful. I to add to that and compound it and maybe make it even a little more provocative, I don't care if we win the cyber war. It's the war.
Yeah. Right.
And ultimately we have actors. Do I care if we win? Of course I care if we win the cyber war too. But the truth is it's those that are integrating cyber into their warfighting strategy doctrine, which is bled beyond the traditional battlefield to incorporate all of society. What questions didn't I ask that I should?
I'm not going to make a prediction on personnel, so I think.
Sure?
Yes, I'm quite positive. I think that we have an opportunity whenever there's a new administration, and especially when there's one that has no fear of being provocative
And doing things differently.
That you have a space for both innovation and change that is opportunistic, and I look forward to hearing a lot more from them.
So I predict we have a national cyber director named Tom Fanning. We have a Matt Hayden in a very senior position over at DHS CISA. But most importantly, what I predict is, as I do think we're going to take a more robust approach towards Chinese malicious behavior in cyberspace over the next 2 or 3 years. It won't be on day one. It's not going to be an executive order that says go kick butt. It's going to be a series of actions that cause us to take a more aggressive approach to inappropriate actions by adversaries, principally China, but others once in a while will stagger into our foresight.
Which is overdue. Gentlemen, thank you. Happy New Year, and welcome back for Season 2. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Cyber Focus. If you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing. Your ratings and reviews help us reach more listeners. Drop us a line if you have any ideas in terms of topics, themes, or individuals you'd like for us to host. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and stay curious.